Hey, welcome back to my channel and Happy New Year. In this video, I'll be reviewing the BaoHong Academy cold press watercolor paper that I got from my Jackson's haul. And the reason that I wanted to do this review is because the paper is 100% cotton, which should mean that it's a good quality paper, but it's also reasonably affordable in comparison to other 100% cotton papers. It is 31 by 21 centimeters, which means that it's slightly larger than A4 or letter size. It's cold press paper, which means that the paper itself has a bit of tooth or texture to it, which tends to vary from brand to brand, as you can see in comparison to the Dale & Rowley paper, and that's normal. It's 300 GSM, which is nice and thick. It's a pad, which means that it's glued on all four sides so the paper dries flat, and it comes with 20 sheets. I got it from Jackson's on sale for $15.80, but currently the price is $16.90. This is the piece that I'm going to be creating in this video, and the reason that I picked these paintings is because I wanted to really push the paper. I wanted to try this bokeh technique, which involves wet on dry technique, wet on wet technique, lifting, layering, and really give us a good idea of how this paper works and whether it really holds up. Starting off with the wet on wet technique, I actually thought that this worked quite nicely on this paper because I was able to get really nice gradients and blends together without getting blooms or the cauliflower effect, which is when the paper dries unevenly. So that was something that I was really pleased to see. I then let that layer dry and did another layer on top. So this was just looking more at like layering. Am I able to layer? Am I able to glaze? Is it going to reactivate all the paint underneath? And this also worked quite nicely. And the way that you're able to tell that that's happening is the fact that I'm able to add the purple on top of the yellow without it kind of turning brown or grey. So that just lets you know that the purple in its own right isn't reactivating the layers beneath it. As you may be able to appreciate from the painting that I did on the left, bokeh is kind of this blurry background that's out of focus, and quite often lights are represented with circles or appear to be circles, and this is the effect that I'm trying to go for. And I experimented with 4 different techniques in this video in order to give that effect. So one way was using the stickers on the top right painting, which didn't work very well. The next way that you're seeing me do here is to try and lift the paint to really see like whether that works, and another way was using the masking fluid. With regards to the lifting, I found that with this paper the lifting worked quite nicely maybe on the first layer and the second layer, but thereafter I wasn't really able to lift the paint properly. And when I tried, the paper would still remain stained, but only in parts of it, so that the texture of the paper became more apparent, which wasn't an effect that I wanted. It is worth bearing in mind that different colours will behave differently and different colours will stain the paper differently, but this was just a general observation that lifting only really worked nicely for me with the yellows, and thereafter the paper was just too heavily stained by the colours. To create the bokeh effect, you essentially do a layer, then you add either a circle or some masking fluid to preserve that colour, and then you layer again, and in that second layer you add more masking fluid to again preserve that color, and then you layer again, and you keep repeating this over and over. So this is the 4th time that I am doing it, and as you can see, the paper is actually holding up in terms of holding water. Like, I added way more water than I normally would because I really wanted to see whether this paper could handle it, and so far it is. For one, it hasn't buckled, and 2, like, the paper hasn't degraded. That effect where normally with cellulose paper or with wood paper, after the second layer the paper starts peeling off, that hasn't happened yet, and that is the 4th layer that I have done so far on the painting at the top right. And I think that all in all I end up doing that 6 times before I get to a color and a level of depth that I am happy with the painting on the top right. For the painting on the bottom right, instead of using masking fluid or a sticker to preserve the circle, I was actually lifting the circle. So what I would do is use a paintbrush that's slightly damp, gently rub it on a piece of paper in a circular motion, and then either use a towel or a tissue to just lift up that paint color. And as I mentioned earlier, this worked nicely for the first few layers, but then not so much so after. So I had to go back and actually use gouache to kind of preserve some of those circles and go back and paint it. So that was another technique that I had to employ. So one of the things that I did like about it though is that the transitions or the circles are a lot more delicate in comparison to the other circles, which I actually think looks a little bit more like it's meant to in comparison to the other paintings, but still was something nice to experiment with. Before I address some of the cons of the paper, I just wanted to reiterate some of the pros that I've experienced so far, bearing in mind that prior to this, I was used to using wood or cellulose based paper. So one of the things that struck out to me was definitely how nicely the colors blend together, especially when I'm doing wet on wet technique. It's almost like I don't have to put in that much effort. The colors are just going to blend themselves, which is lovely. I didn't have or struggle to kind of fight blooms or the cauliflower effect, which I normally absolutely detest. That didn't happen. The colors were just able to blend nicely. Wet on dry technique worked fine as well, so I was able to add extra details such as the details on the stars and the bow, and I was able to layer like never before. I mean, some of these paintings had maybe like 6 or 7 layers. The paper didn't peel at all, it didn't tear. It was amazing. Like, I've never had anything like that before. And even when I took off the masking tape later and when I took off the masking fluid, nothing, it didn't tear. It just resisted everything, which is amazing. And that's pretty much what led to these 4 beautiful paintings that I think will make wonderful Christmas card designs for later on in the year. Of course, nothing is perfect, so I just wanted to highlight some of the cons of this paper so that you can see whether they're acceptable to you or not. One of the things is that I don't think it's double-sided by the nature of the fact, one, being glued on all 4 sides, but also, as you can see, the paint went through to the back. It didn't affect the paper underneath, but it's worth noting that the back was stained. I think because I used so much water, some of the glue on the sides actually started coming off, so it's not completely glued all across. But again, I think that's in part because of how much water I use, so it does depend on how much water you would normally use, and it's just something to be careful of. I did think vibrancy was a bit of an issue. So as you can see here, when the paint is wet, it's nice and vibrant, and then as soon as it dried, it would just kind of get desaturated. Now, I was able to eventually get the effect that I wanted by layering more and more and more, but that's again something to be mindful of if you don't normally use that many layers. The last con comes down to personal preference, and that's just that for me, I didn't like how much I could see the texture of the paper. Normally I'm used to using Daler Rowley, which as you can see is just a little bit smoother. But on the whole, I was pleasantly surprised by this paper, and I think it's lived up to its reputation. With regards to bokeh, as I mentioned, I did 4 styles. So one was with the round stickers, and that didn't work for me at all because the paint seeped underneath the stickers. The other way that I tried to do it was using a paintbrush, which you can do with or without a stencil. This actually gave the most delicate of effects, which I think in a way was nice, but was slightly limited because essentially as soon as I put on a second layer, all the circles that I had created almost entirely disappeared, which meant that I had to go onto the other technique, which was basically using some gouache to complement some of the circles. And I think that this worked quite nicely because I was adding gouache at the end, almost the same way that I would normally add highlights, rather than trying to add gouache in between the layers of watercolor, which I don't think would have worked nicely. So this essentially gives a bit more of a natural bokeh effect, if you like. And last but not least, I essentially used masking fluid. So this worked quite nicely again. It did have like stronger effect, like stronger circles, more distinct. So this again will be down to personal preference if that's what you want or don't want. If I could give you 2 tips for using masking fluid, it would be this. 1, don't use your good or expensive paintbrushes, just use the cheapest one you can find. And 2, it would be to actually coat your paintbrush with washing up liquid before you add the masking fluid, and it will actually preserve your paintbrush. It will make it so much easier to remove the masking fluid without damaging it any further. And without further ado, here are the final results. So the paint did seep underneath the masking tape, but I think that's a me thing because it happens to me like almost all the time as opposed to a paper thing. The paper dried straight and didn't warp. But yeah, I really enjoyed painting on this paper, and I think editing this video made me fully appreciate just how many layers of paint I was able to add. and I can't wait to compare it to other papers. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much. You're a real MVP and I really appreciate you. Let me know that you made it this far into the video by telling me which of the paintings is your favorite, the two baubles, the red background, green background, or yellow background. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week. Bye.